Hello and welcome to episode 7 of Revive and Thrive, a podcast about burnout. And I'm your host, Joshua Blum. And today's episode is brought to you by the letter G. G could stand for a lot of things, but I'm actually using it to stand for the gastrointestinal system. Now, why that particular thing when it comes to this particular topic? Those of you who do GI, particularly peds GI, know this well, that mental health and your gastrointestinal system are very, very closely linked. It's one of those things that when you think about it, it is very obvious, right? But I think often in medicine, we have a way of siloing things into these different systems. And sometimes we lose the more 50,000 foot view of that these things are all connected in their own ways because we learn about things in organ systems. And we're specialized that way. You know, I'll give you an example. I see many folks who are, they're mostly young adults, and I would say in terms of their overall physical health, most of them are pretty healthy. I would say many of them struggle with headaches. They may struggle with chronic pain issues, particularly around joints like their back and their shoulders and neck, and then stomach issues, particularly nausea, diarrhea. Sometimes it's been diagnosed up to that point as things like abdominal migraines or reflux. One person had been worked up for quite a long time for intractable hiccups that ultimately turned out to be GERD, because it went away when we used omeprazole. So they may have been seen for those things, and oddly enough, a lot of those somatic issues go away once the mental health stuff is treated. Because I have the advantage of seeing folks over the course of their 4 years, because I'm working in a university, I get to see the starting point, and then I get to see the ending point, or at least what they look like when they either stop coming or when they graduate. And if they're successful in getting those mental health things treated, a lot of those bodily issues just sort of magically go away. And I don't say magically, but it's not magic to me. But to them, when you ask them, it's like, well, you still have headaches. You know, that was such an issue before. You know, they were getting scans and all these other things like that. And they're like, oh, no, I don't have those anymore. What happened to those? Or, you know, I'm not burping as much, or I don't have gas as much, or I'm not nauseous as much. Where did that go? That's if we haven't had the conversation about how these things are all linked up. But often before that, we'll often talk about how our mental health is often related to a variety of different things, but it's our nervous system, right? And that permeates our entire body. And so it's, of course, going to affect other organ systems as well, even though it may not be ones that you necessarily associate with emotions. Now, I think if you talk to lay people, they often will make these linkages too, though, right? You may know that if you have something stressful, your stomach may feel a little bit funny. Maybe the day before a big test or sporting event, you don't feel like eating. If there is, again, a big thing coming up, you go to the bathroom a lot. So people inherently know these things. So I bring this up because sometimes we may not necessarily have a great sense of how we are doing mentally. When it comes to mental health for physicians, we have to think, of course, about how mental health is viewed still within the medical community for ourselves. It's often still stigmatized. Even if it's less stigmatized for people that we see as patients, for us, it's still often stigmatized. It may result in disciplinary sort of things. It's not quite the right word, but when we have to apply for licensing, and if someone is not doing well, there is the question of, are you fit to practice? Sometimes you have to report whether you got treatment for X, Y, or Z when you go to get your license renewed. All these kinds of things like that create barriers for us, can make us more suspicious of getting the kind of help that we may need. And then there's also the other thing too. Let's say you work in a hospital. Who do you go to see? You go to see a therapist or a psychiatrist or somebody like that. You may be working with those people professionally. Can you go to see them? I mean, there's a conflict of interest there. Ideally, you want someone who's totally outside the system, but in some places, that may not exist at all. I live in an area, for example, in central Pennsylvania, where there's like very few mental health resources. And the ones that are around, there's a really long wait list. So where do you go? I would say the advent or the introduction of telehealth, much more in a widespread way, after the pandemic, has really increased access for a whole host of people, including physicians, because you're not necessarily limited by geography anymore. But historically, it's been a huge issue. And then, of course, even if it is telehealth, there may still be the issue, all the same issues that I mentioned before. There can be a lot of reasons why it just doesn't, we may not necessarily want to admit to ourselves that we're not doing well mentally. And I put this, the idea of being burned out does not necessarily always equal a mental health diagnosis, but there is usually a mental health component to it. So even though this is not a mental health podcast, it has everything to do with mental health, I would say. One way to kind of drive this home, even though it's a side topic, when people struggle with something like major depression, they will often notice their GI system is affected, as I mentioned before, and it often will slow down. Things will often slow down. They may struggle with appetite issues, like they lose their appetite, they don't eat as often, and that may in fact cause them to become more constipated because they're eating less. And they may also be more sedentary, and if they're sitting more, they may also, that may also contribute to constipation. But that link is pretty clear. And likewise with anxiety, people may notice that they are more nauseous, they have more diarrhea. In other words, things kind of speed up a bit. They may also, again, though, lose their appetite because they're nauseous, or they may eat more because they're stressed, and that's comforting, for some people. So I mention that because in some cases, you may, due to all the reasons I mentioned before, not be aware of how you're doing mentally, but you may notice some of these GI changes. You may notice, geez, I seem to be eating a lot more. I'm like stress eating, or I've lost my appetite. You may notice your weight has decreased. That's often what we see with patients. They may notice that they'll lose a significant amount of weight in a relatively short amount of time, and their overall activity is not necessarily different. It's because they're eating less. They don't feel as hungry, and the drive to eat is not there. So if you do happen to notice that, it can be a good clue. Like, obviously, if you do notice that for yourself, you'd want to think about the usual things that you would think about with weight loss in an otherwise seemingly healthy person. But sometimes they can give you clues. I mean, are you eating? Are you making time for that? And I know that sounds overly obvious. That's like, why would you have to mention that? Again, most of these things in these episodes probably seem obvious in various ways, but they seem obvious because they're basic. Basic does not necessarily mean they're always done. In fact, most of these things are often not done. The eating thing is interesting. It's an interesting thing. With physicians. I don't have any data to support this. It's just an observation I recall from medical school and in residency, a little bit less so, but particularly in medical school, that eating and taking time for lunch was seen as I don't want to say luxury. I guess it was seen as like, if you did that, you weren't working hard. And so most of the people that I saw, they didn't actually eat lunch at all. Or they would take a bite of something, and then they would go see a patient, and then they would take another bite. I remember one guy I was working with, he was an oncologist, and he was seeing patients who were coming to him for breast cancer. So it was really weird because I remember he asked a nurse to bring him whatever it was that they were serving in the cafeteria. And it was like literally the most unappetizing thing ever. It was like plain rice. It didn't have anything on it. And it was like a couple of pieces of like chicken. And there was like no vegetables, no sauce, and nothing. And he offered me some, which was very nice, but he would like take a bite of one piece of chicken, a little bit of rice, then go see a patient, then come back. He would write his note, typing his notes on the computer or dictating them or whatever. And then the fork would still be stuck in the chicken, and then he'd like take another bite maybe later. But most of the food went uneaten, which may in fact be like what just due to it not being very appetizing. I remember asking him, like, do do you want to like sit down and eat? I'll go see this next patient like for the next however many minutes so you can finish your meal. He's like, no. I do this every day. And the nurses would kind of laugh and say like, yeah, he always does this. And this happened again and again and again and again. And I remember making a pledge to myself, like, okay, when I become an attending, I am not going to do that. But I would see it with my attendings when I was in residency. They would do the same thing. And so, I mean, it's a cultural kind of thing, I think, that we have, and it may be a thing that's more prevalent in the U.S. I don't know. Talking to folks from other parts of the world, however, it's not necessarily like that. When I worked in other countries, spent some time working in East Africa, it was things definitely moved at a much slower pace. A couple of years ago, my wife and I took a trip to Italy, and I remember this one place we went to eat. It was a little cafe, and we got there. Now we had, I think, one child at that point, and so meals, I think it was my daughter who's, I think, about 3, and so she was definitely eating solid food, but the meals would take a while. It would take a while for her to eat stuff. And there would usually be diaper changes and things like that you would have to go through and all that kind of stuff. So we were pretty slow to get there, to leave and so forth. So it was probably about a good 2 hours, And there was this 2 businessmen that were sitting next to us. It was a weekday. They were there before we got there, and they were there after we left. And they were eating and chatting the whole time. And I remember marveling, like, wouldn't that be nice just to be able to take your time when you're eating, because it seems like such a foreign concept. And so I would say that is one of those things that if you haven't had the chance to do that, give it a try. It's one of those things that's not typically, I think, stereotypically part of the like U.S. physician culture, but it's kind of a cool thing if you can make it happen. One of the places where I did rotations, I thought about going to residency there. They gave people food. All the employees could eat at the cafeteria for free. And it was just a very, very different feel, doing morning report or conferences or whatever at the cafeteria where people were actually eating and taking the time for themselves to actually have some energy as opposed to sitting elsewhere in an auditorium or a random room somewhere or standing in the wards or whatever and being hungry and doing that. So just a different feel. And if you have some time that is allotted for you to eat, one little actionable step that you might try taking is to protect that time. Try to have as few interruptions on that little sanctuary of time as you can. Sort of the opposite of the oncologist that I mentioned, who was taking a bite and then trying to see a patient and then answering a page and stuff like that. Yeah, that may have worked for him, but it looked miserable. And so if you think that also looks miserable, don't do it. That's what I would say for today's. Pay attention to some of these little bodily signals. In this case, it's the GI system, because they may in fact be linked to your overall mental health. We certainly see it in psychiatry, and you see it in other specialties too, though it probably gets called a different name. So it can be helpful for you as well. So thanks as always for listening. I'll talk to you guys next week.